The room was bathed in the soft glow of a single bedside lamp, its golden light casting long shadows across the walls. Camille slept soundly, her face turned toward the window, chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of deep slumber. Her auburn hair spilled across the silk pillowcase, framing her serene expression. To anyone else, it would have been a picture of tranquil domesticity, but for Max, sitting on the edge of the bed, the image had taken on a sinister hue. He gripped Camille's phone in trembling hands, the cold device weighing heavy like a stone. His heart pounded in his ears as he hesitated over the screen, the faint buzz of adrenaline coursing through him. His instincts, honed from years of negotiating high-stakes deals, told him something was deeply wrong. For weeks, he had dismissed the late-night whispers, the hastily ended calls, the sudden trips to catch up with old friends. But tonight, with her asleep beside him and his gut churning, he couldn't ignore it anymore. Max scrolled further, his chest tightening with every word. The messages told a story of passion, secrets, and lies woven right under his nose. Phrases like, "I can't stop thinking about last weekend," and "When will he leave for his next trip?" sent icy shards of betrayal deep into his core. Attached photos followed, stolen moments of intimacy, the backdrop unmistakably Brian's lake house, where they'd all shared summers together. His hand shook as he turned off the phone and stared at the darkness outside the window. The gravity of the betrayal hit him in waves, drowning him in a mix of fury and anguish. Camille stirred but didn't wake, her lips curving into a faint smile as though saving a pleasant dream. Max swallowed the bitter bile rising in his throat. He couldn't confront her. Not yet. Sliding the phone back to its place on the nightstand, Max stood, his movements deliberate and silent. He had questions that demanded answers, but not from her. First, he needed to see Brian. Max's mind churned as he made his way to the kitchen for a drink to steady his nerves. He poured a measure of bourbon and stared into its amber depths. This wasn't just a betrayal of marriage, it was the violation of a brotherhood, forged over decades. As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, Max drained his glass. He would go to Brian first. He needed to see the truth in his so-called friend's eyes before deciding what came next. Justice, vengeance, or control. Whatever path he chose, it would be on his terms. The bell above the diner door chimed softly as Max entered, his reflection flickering in the glass panes, fogged from the heat of the kitchen. The scent of coffee and sizzling bacon hung in the air, clashing with the cold steel resolve brewing inside him. This place, where he and Brian had spent countless mornings nursing hangovers in college, planning fishing trips, and toasting each other's successes, now felt alien, almost hostile. Brian was already seated in their usual booth at the back, his broad shoulders hunched over a steaming cup of coffee. He looked up and grinned as Max approached, a smile so easy and unguarded it made Max's skin crawl. For a brief moment, Max faltered. Could he have been wrong? Could all the evidence he'd uncovered somehow be misinterpreted? Then Brian leaned back in the booth, his casual confidence unmistakable, and the doubts vanished. "Max, you look like hell. Long night?" Brian gestured to the seat across from him, his voice warm and familiar. Max sat, forcing his expression into one of neutrality, though his fists clenched beneath the table. "Something like that," Max replied, his voice tight. The waitress approached, her smile faltering slightly at the tension radiating from him. Just coffee," he muttered, barely glancing her way. The silence stretched as the coffee arrived. Max stirred his cup methodically, staring into the dark liquid, his mind racing with how to begin. Confrontation wasn't his nature, but the betrayal demanded action. Brian, oblivious or pretending to be, broke the silence. "Camille doing okay?" he asked, his tone casual. The audacity of it made Max's blood boil. "She's fine," Max said evenly. His eyes snapped up to meet Brian's, the weight of his stare making his old friend shift uncomfortably. "Though I'm curious. When was the last time you saw her?" Brian laughed, though it sounded forced. "What kind of question is that? Probably that barbecue last month. Why?" Max leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Don't lie to me, Brian. Not now." The grin slid from Brian's face like a mask falling away. His hand tightened around the coffee cup as his eyes darted around the diner, scanning for anyone paying too much attention. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "You know damn well what I'm talking about." Max's voice didn't rise, but the intensity behind it sharpened with every word. "I know about the messages, the photos, the weekends at the lake house. I know everything, Brian." Brian's face paled, the easy charisma he always carried slipping away. He opened his mouth to speak, but Max held up a hand. "Don't bother. I'm not here to listen to excuses or lies. I want to hear the truth, straight from you. When did it start? Why?" The question hung between them like a loaded gun. Brian stared into his coffee, his jaw working as though chewing on the words before finally answering. "It wasn't supposed to happen, I swear, Max. It just did." Max's laugh was cold and humorless. "That's the best you've got? After all these years of friendship, that's the explanation? It just did?" Brian looked up, guilt and defiance warring in his eyes. "It's not what you think. Camille, she was lonely, man. You're always traveling for work, always gone. She needed someone. I didn't plan for it, but..." Max slammed his hand down on the table, making Brian flinch. "Don't you dare try to shift the blame onto me. You betrayed me, Brian. Both of you did." Brian's voice grew defensive. "I'm not saying it's your fault. I'm just saying, it happened. And it's over now, okay? It's done." Max's eyes burned with a cold fury. "No, Brian, it's not over. You're going to end it today. You're going to tell her it's done, and you're going to confess to her what we've talked about here. Because if you don't, I will. And when I do, it won't just be a private matter between friends. I'll destroy both of you. Publicly, completely. Do you understand me?" Brian's face twisted with anger, but he nodded, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "Fine, I'll tell her." Max leaned back, his voice steady again. "See that you do, and don't mistake this as forgiveness. You're dead to me, Brian." Without waiting for a response, Max stood and walked out of the diner, the bell chiming faintly behind him. Outside, the crisp air filled his lungs, but it did nothing to clear the storm raging within him. He wasn't done, not yet. The tension in the house was suffocating, even though Camille remained oblivious. Max had returned from his meeting with Brian carrying a new clarity, but it was the kind of clarity that didn't offer peace, it demanded action. Each interaction with his wife felt like playing a high-stakes game of chess, every move calculated, every word scrutinized. The following evening, Max stood in the kitchen, the scent of freshly brewed coffee mixing with Camille's lavender perfume as she entered the room. She looked radiant, a hair pinned up in a style she reserved for special occasions. "You're back early," she said, her tone light, yet her eyes flickered with something cautious. "I thought I'd spend the evening here. It's been a while since we had a quiet dinner together." Max offered her a small smile, the kind that masked the churning fury inside him. He placed 2 plates on the table, their favorite pasta dish, a recipe Camille used to rave about. "Figured I'd try my hand at something special." Camille hesitated, her gaze darting to the phone she'd set on the counter. "This is nice," she said, sitting down, though she fidgeted with her napkin. "I wasn't expecting it." "Neither was I," Max replied, his voice even. "It's funny how surprises can sneak up on you, isn't it?" For a moment, they ate in silence, the clink of utensils against porcelain the only sound. Camille seemed distracted, glancing at her phone every few minutes. Max, however, noticed everything. The way her hand twitched slightly when she picked up a glass of wine, the way her eyes avoided his whenever he tried to meet them. "Camille," Max said finally, his tone casual, "I've been thinking maybe we should take a trip, just the two of us. It's been a while since we've had time to reconnect." Camille looked startled, almost panicked. "A trip? I mean, that sounds nice, but you're so busy with work and You've been busy too, Max," interrupted gently, leaning forward. "All those phone calls, the trips to Brian's lake house. You must be exhausted." The wine glass in Camille's hand froze mid-air. Her knuckles whitened as she placed it carefully on the table. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice just a shade too steady. Max's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm talking about the folder on your phone labeled Memories. I'm talking about the photos, the messages. Should I go on?" The color drained from Camille's face, and she opened her mouth to speak, but Max held up a hand. "Save it. I'm not interested in your excuses or denials. I've already spoken to Brian." Her gasp was audible, her hand flying to her mouth. "You? You spoke to Brian?" Max nodded, his expression cold and detached. "I did. And you'll be happy to know he's decided to end this ridiculous charade. But that's not where this ends, Camille. You're going to tell me everything, how long it's been going on, how you thought you'd get away with it, and you're going to do it now." Camille's lips trembled, her facade cracking. For the first time, Max saw fear in her eyes, and while it should have given him satisfaction, all he felt was an overwhelming, aching hollowness. The dining room had never felt colder. Camille's carefully curated world, her perfect marriage, her polished image, was unraveling, and it showed in the way her trembling hands betrayed her composure. Max leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his eyes never leaving her. The weight of his stare pinned her in place, and she knew there was no escape. "How long?" Max's voice cut through the silence, sharp and unyielding. Camille swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it impossible to answer immediately. Her mind raced, weighing the consequences of lying against the pain of telling the truth. Max was not a man who appreciated being played, but her instincts to protect herself flared up regardless. 2 years, she whispered finally, her voice breaking under the weight of the admission. "It started 2 years ago." Max's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his silence pressing her to continue. She gripped the edge of the table as if it might anchor her in the storm. "It wasn't supposed to mean anything, Max. You were always gone. You were married to your work, and I—" She hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. "I felt invisible." Max laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Invisible? Spare me, Camille. You were far from invisible when you were cashing the checks my work provided, planning vacations, and shopping for your designer wardrobes." Camille flinched at the accusation, her tears now spilling freely. "It's not about money, Max. It's about connection. You don't know what it's like to feel alone in your own marriage." Max's fists clenched under the table, but he kept his voice even. "And you thought the solution was my best friend? Brian, of all people?" "It just happened," Camille said, shaking her head as if trying to convince herself. "We started talking, confiding in each other. I didn't plan for it to go this far." "Talking," Max repeated, his tone icy. "Is that what you call sneaking around, lying to my face, and turning my marriage into a farce?" Camille sobbed, burying her face in her hands. For a moment Max felt a flicker of pity, but it was fleeting, smothered by the memory of the texts, the photos, and the betrayal that had shattered his trust. I gave you everything, Max said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that silenced Camille's sobs. A home, a life people only dream of, and this is what you chose to do with it? I'm sorry, Camille whispered, her voice muffled. I was stupid, selfish, but it didn't mean I stopped loving you. Max's bitter smile returned. Love? Don't insult me, Camille. Whatever you feel for me isn't love. Love doesn't lie. Love doesn't destroy trust. Love doesn't. His voice faltered, his anger slipping just enough to reveal the deep hurt beneath it. Camille lifted her tear-streaked face, her desperation palpable. Please, Max, we can fix this. I'll end it with Brian. I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't give up on us. Max stood, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He stared down at her, the woman he had once adored and now barely recognized. You ended us the moment you chose him over me. His voice was quiet but final. And there's no going back. He turned and walked out, leaving Camille sobbing alone at the table. Upstairs, he locked himself in the guest bedroom. Justice wasn't served yet. But Max knew it was coming. He would ensure of it. The morning light spilled through the windows, its warmth a jarring contrast to the icy tension in the house. Camille had barely slept, her puffy eyes and pale complexion betraying the sleepless night spent replaying Max's cutting words. She moved through the kitchen robotically, starting coffee, her hands trembling as she reached for a mug. Upstairs, Max showered and dressed with the precision of a man preparing for battle. He wasn't done, not yet. By the time he came downstairs, his suitcase in hand, Camille was perched at the kitchen island, nursing her coffee like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She looked up at him, her expression a blend of guilt and hope. Where are you going? She asked, her voice fragile. Work trip, Max replied curtly, setting his suitcase by the door. But don't think for a second that this is over. When I get back, we'll talk about next steps. Until then, I suggest you use this time to think about what you want your future to look like. The words landed like a physical blow. Camille opened her mouth to respond, but Max was already out the door, his mind racing with plans. Max drove in silence, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. His first destination wasn't the office, but a discreet meeting with a divorce attorney he'd found through a colleague. The sleek downtown office exuded professionalism and discretion. Max was ushered into a conference room, where a sharp-eyed woman introduced herself as Vanessa Clark. I've reviewed the details you sent over, Vanessa began, her voice calm but firm. You've done well to document everything so far. The messages, the photos, the timeline, it all paints a very clear picture. Max leaned forward, his voice low. I don't just want a divorce. I want to make sure she and Brian feel the full weight of what they've done. Vanessa nodded, sliding a legal pad across the table. We'll start by securing your assets. Your prenup is solid, but we need to ensure she can't claim anything beyond what's outlined. I'll also subpoena Brian if necessary. Adultery can still be used as leverage in court. Max's lips curled into a grim smile. Good. I want this to hurt. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. Revenge is satisfying, but be careful, the courts will view you more favorably if you appear composed and focused on resolution rather than retaliation. I understand, Max said, but as he left the office, his thoughts were anything but composed. The next step was confronting Brian again, this time with a clear goal. Max had no intention of simply cutting ties. He intended to burn the bridge entirely. He arranged a meeting at Brian's lake house, the site of so many betrayals. Brian greeted him cautiously, his usual confidence eroded by the previous confrontation. Max, he began, But Max raised a hand to silence him. "Save it," Max said, stepping inside and closing the door firmly. "I'm not here to rehash what you've done. I'm here to tell you what's going to happen next." Max outlined his terms with ruthless clarity. Brian would publicly confess to the affair, end all contact with Camille, and resign from their shared social circles. Failure to comply would result in Max leaking every sordid detail to their professional network and ensuring Brian's name became synonymous with betrayal. Brian's face paled, his protests weak. "You don't have to do this, Max. You didn't have to betray me." Max shot back, his voice cold. "This is me being merciful." That evening, Max sat in his hotel room, staring at his phone. A message from Camille blinked on the screen. "Can we talk? Please, Max." He didn't respond. Instead, he opened his laptop and began drafting an email to their closest friends, a measured and composed explanation of their impending separation. The truth would come out on his terms, in his time. As the night deepened, Max felt a strange calm settle over him. The betrayal had shattered his world, but in the ruins he was building something stronger, a future on his own terms, free of lies. Justice wasn't just coming, it was already here.